Hi, everyone. We're just going to allow a few minutes for people to arrive. I would like to welcome you all to SCMA Conversations. My name is Lauren Shea Warner, and I am the Membership Engagement and Stewardship Coordinator. Today's program features Terry Ragasa, butcher and co-owner of Sutter Meats, and Emma Chubb, Charlotte Feng Ford, Class of '83, Curator of Contemporary Art. Next slide, please. Before I hand this over to our panelists, a few housekeeping items. We encourage you to type in the Q&A box throughout the presentation or in the Facebook Live post. Emma and Terry will be following along and look forward to answering any questions you may have. I will now turn it over to Emma.
Thank you. Hi, everybody, welcome. So one of the most, I think, rewarding things about studying art, at least for me, is that art was never made in a vacuum. It's never meant to be viewed in a vacuum. It's really something that invites us to think and research in many directions and to consider how, for example, social, political, theoretical, scientific, or industrial histories intersect with artistic and cultural ones. And so while museum staff regularly consult with experts from other institutions and professions as part of our work, more often than not, these conversations take place behind the scenes. But this summer, we wanted to organize two programs that bring these conversations into public view in order to collectively deepen our understanding of works in SCMA's collection by learning from experts in our communities. So we were so fortunate today to be joined by Terry Ragasa, who is a butcher and the co-owner with his wife, Susan Ragasa, of Sutter Meats on King Street in downtown Northampton. Since opening the shop in 2014, Terry, Susan, and their whole team have been dedicated to preserving the craft of traditional butchery, to narrowing the gap between the eater and their food source, and to fostering community. Key to this work is exclusively buying whole animals from local farms, knowing how the animals were raised and slaughtered, and striving to use the entire animal. Before opening Sutter Meats, Terry apprenticed with master butcher Joshua Applestone of Fleischer's Grass-Fed and Organic Meats in New York's Hudson Valley, and he then developed the first whole animal butchery program in the Fort Greene neighborhood of Brooklyn and helped to open a green grocer and butcher in the Chelsea neighborhood of Manhattan. He studied photography at the School of Visual Arts and then worked at Christie's in New York before becoming a butcher, and maybe he'll tell us a little bit about that in the Q&A at the end. So we are really centering our conversation today on a painting entitled Meat by Honoré Sharrer. She painted it between 1975 and 1978. And this is a conversation I've been wanting to have since SCMA purchased this painting in 2019, which was right after we were a venue for a nationally traveling exhibition entitled A Dangerous Woman, Subversion and Surrealism in the Art of Honoré Sharrer. So just to tell you a little bit about the painting before we start chatting. Sharrer was born in 1920 and she died in 2009, and she was an incredibly accomplished painter, capable of rendering her subjects with an intense realism, but her art never provided straightforward depictions of reality. Instead, she included details that disturbed seemingly straightforward scenes with their visual oddity or trompe-l'oeil effects, an approach that some have characterized as surreal or as magic realism, although she disliked that latter term. And these details were important because they were part of how she layered social commentary and critique into her paintings. And this became increasingly necessary to code these references and these social commentaries and critiques during the Cold War. And this is something that gets talked about in the scholarship on her work, notably the catalog for the show, if anyone's interested in learning more. But in that catalog, curator Melissa Wolf argues that Sharrer's paintings, and I'll quote Wolf, reveal the discordant incapacity of Cold War conventions to account for the genuine fullness of ordinary life. And Wolf sees the seriousness of Sharrer's work as being overlooked in, quote, the typical characterization of her work as sly, witty, or cheeky, which denies the sophisticated content of her slant view through seemingly benign linguistic machinations that have compartmentalized and marginalized women's artistic and intellectual production from serious consideration and analysis for generations, end quote. Sharrer described her approach as follows. She said, I want to keep the viewer guessing, so my paintings are full of non sequiturs. I can paint very realistically, but I'm countering the extreme realism. It seems very simple, but that's the interesting challenge of supposedly realist art, end quote. And so our conversation today aspires in part to ascertain where in this painting the realism ends and the non sequiturs begin with regard to its titular subject, meat. So Terry, to begin, I wonder if you could tell us what you see in this painting and how Sharrer's depiction of meat corresponds with or diverges from the meat that you work with and prepare in your shop.
Sure, yeah. Thanks for having me. I'm proud and happy to be here. Well, the first thing I see is a couple $100. That's a pretty expensive cut of meat there, right in the middle of the painting. It would be something that we would sell at that size only a couple times out of the year. It's would be what we call like a prime rib roast from the center of a rib section of beef. The number of ribs there, what looks like 4 ribs that would feed 8 to 10 people. So that would be something that would be on offer for quite a gathering, and something that would be for a celebration. So we see that in the holidays, Christmas time, sometimes Father's Day, big birthday celebrations, it's definitely not an everyday cut there. We do sell individually steaks off of that section. It would be called ribeye steaks, and that's a very popular cut that we offer regularly at the shop. But to see something of that size going out the door to a customer, it's rare, and it's something that only a handful of people would be able to do on a regular basis, or even if they wanted to, just because of the sheer the cost of that.
And actually, Louise, if we can do the next slide. So you shared this photo with me of kind of a side-by-side comparison. So I wondered if you could kind of take us through some of the, like, in addition to what you've just raised, thinking about, we've talked a little bit about the kind of cut section in the bottom left of the representation of the meat. And just tell us a little bit about that and how you sort of see that, how much it aligns with what the actual piece of meat or kind of would look like.
Yeah, so I mean the meat itself on hers, it looks like it would come from the loin end. So if you break down a head of beef, what we do is we first we get it in forequarters and hindquarters. So the forequarter consists of a chuck section, which is a name for the shoulder, and then a rib section and plate section, which is a section where we get these ribeyes and what we call short ribs. And so there's 2 ends of it. There's one that would be the shoulder end, which would be the part that would connect the rib section to the chuck. And that's what you see on my photograph, where you have a smaller eye of the steak right in the middle, and then you have a larger cap, which would kind of hug the center of that eye, and then a large, what we call a decal running on the outside of the meat. Whereas on her end, that would be the loin end, where you would have much more of a larger eye of the steak. That would be the part that would abut to the loin section of meat, which would be part of the hind quarter. So on the beef, you have the center sections of meats where you have 2 big steaks. You have the ribeye section, the ribeye steaks, and then you would have your New York strip steaks. After the 13th rib, which would be pretty much where what's being showcased on her side, you have a continuation of the spinal column, but those would be more of T-bones, and you would get what you would call strip steaks off of those T-bones. And then another muscle would run along the T-bone, which would be called the tenderloin. So you have very tender cut of meat because it's from the center of the animal, and it's very meaty as well. Right? So there's a lot of actual meat to bone and to fat ratio on something like this. It looks a little bit different than what I would see typically in our shop. In the bottom section here, where like the cross section of the bone, that's why we showed a cross section of an actual tibia here, because I was thinking that would be the bone. I think that the cross section of bone that's at the bottom of of her steak is actually the cross section of a tibia bone, which is part of the forequarter, via the front arm of the animal. So it's hard to see even when it's zoomed in this far, but you see just the striations of fat that surround the bone. They're pretty much representative of what we would call an ossobuco, which is Italian for bone hole, and it's just a cross-cut beef shank. And so it's just interesting that you would put that bone and that cut of meat next to the ribeye section, whether she was doing that on purpose, just to show maybe, the whole animal in one cut here, or maybe just because she wanted to bring more of like an idea of like part of the body, whereas like the actual bone that's there doesn't necessarily, I guess, present itself well as like a figurative item there, because you can see on ours, it's just like a cross section of a single color essentially, and it doesn't really have much aesthetic value. Whereas the marrow bone, I think it calls to mind more of like something from an animal, or definitely meat that people are familiar with.
Actually, Louise, can you go to the next one, please? Yeah, so that's a little bit of that detail, because so from your read, that sort of, because it in that moment is a departure from what you would expect to see on the actual cut of meat, that it introduces a kind of set of decisions that she's made there that sort of moves us out of a strictly maybe fully representational mode into something that's maybe about showing a point of severing or calling a body forth a little bit more. Yeah. So one of the things that you mentioned when we first talked and we're looking at this painting together was how this representation of meat really differs from the kind of more standard typical thing we would see in popular culture. And so if we could go to the next slide, I'm wondering if you could tell us about what some of these more common images of meat and butchery are that you kind of reckon with, I think, or have kind of come to you in a way, and how you contend with them as a professional butcher and shop owner, and sort of like, just like, what is the visual language of meat in our society, and how does that then come into how you were looking at this painting, but also the work that you do? Right.
Yeah, it's something that we've had to deal with since we've opened our shop, and when we are looking for ideas for logos or for sort of merchandising, like, oh, let's present a piece of meat somehow, but how do you do that? What is it that people look at a steak and they can recognize that in a meat case, but as like a drawing or other sort of representation, it's very difficult to find something that is appealing and not too off-putting. Like, we want it to look more, I guess, what am I looking for here? It's just, you want to have a little bit of association with meat, but at the same time you want it to be aesthetically pleasing to the eye. And meat itself doesn't necessarily have that. I mean, you see the blood, you see the flesh, you see the fat, and some people really enjoy that, other people don't. So I think I've found it in cartoons, especially. You would find the one here that Tom and Jerry and their friend are salivating over, is a very popular representation of meat in popular culture, and that would be, it's an actual cut of meat. It would be called a round bone chop. So it would be something coming from the leg section of beef, also known as the round, and also has a round bone in the middle of it, which would be part of a femur bone as well. And I see that time and again in cartoons and in other logos and things when they're talking about meat or trying to represent meat in a very simplistic way. Another one would be a T-bone steak, which you see there in the Apple logo there, or Apple icon. And funny enough, that was when we were talking online, just when we were talking by email, and I would start writing steak on my laptop, that Apple icon would always appear. And I never noticed that before, but it's interesting to know that. The other ones look like that they're just different representations of the same item. For us, when we were researching what to put as like some sort of meat item to represent us, we thought that maybe sausage would actually be something that would be a better representation of a butcher. But then how would you represent that in a picture? You don't want to see like a pile of sausage. It'd be more of like links of sausage hanging, because the sausage itself, as just a single sausage doesn't really say much, but in links, it tells more of a story of like, how is this made, or who made this, where's this going? And sausage itself is also really just kind of like the bread and butter of a butcher's business, because especially a whole animal butcher, because there are only so many steaks we can sell off of one animal, or so off of a pig, so many chops we could sell. The rest of it is something that we'd have to grind and make some value-added product out of. So we take great care in making sausages and other value-added items, like different types of charcuterie, pâtés, and so forth. So you can really, if you go into a butcher shop, you look at your cases, you can see all the different custom meat they have, but if you peruse their sausage case, it will really tell you the story of where they're coming from. There's been a lot of, in the last few years, been a big craze in the restaurant industry on like different types of burger grinds. And there's, each restaurant has their own, special type of burger grind, and they're charging, $20 for a burger, and all of a sudden people are paying for it. So, so of course restaurants are going to keep doing it. But on the butchery side of it, like, why can't you do the same thing with the lowly hot dog? And that's what we would rather see, because, it's very easy to grind beef and make a patty, but to make a hot dog, they do have a bad reputation just because people don't know exactly what's in them. But, from a proper butcher shop, you would see that they're made from, whole muscles. They're ground 3 or 4 times, partially frozen, ground again, and emulsified with different seasonings, and then cased. And there's 4 or 5 to 6 steps involved to make a proper sausage. And that's before even smoking it and getting it semi-cured and ready for consumption. So, I think that a hot dog or a sausage would be a great representation for a butcher shop or a butchery. But the steak is something that, I guess, just from its, you look, I guess it just because it satisfies something really animalistic in us, I guess, to see a big hunk of meat. So you want to.
Yeah, I mean, it makes me wonder, just because the kind of Tom and Jerry example is, I think predates the painting by several decades. And then these emojis have obviously been, developed in the last however many years recently. And so thinking about like, this is a kind of long history of these ideas of images of what meat looks like, right? And of course, this happens in many other registers of how we have these images that come to us that are culturally constructed, that have this history that then acts on us in all of these ways. But it's funny because I think we'll see in some of the other examples of Sharrer's work, both a study for this painting and then a painting she did of a butcher shop, where she does include sausages. And I feel like they would be a challenge from just like a visual identity for a shop, just as a proposition. But if we could go to the next slide, please. So, and then we can look at this, and then we have one more that are related. But I wanted us to talk too about the other elements in the painting that really locate us in the realm of butchery and meat processing. So we have the knife that's just below the large cut of meat. We have a saw in the upper right corner. There's a knife sharpener, scissors. There's also the crinkled paper on which we have these 2 shrimp and a clam and a fly. And then the chicken, this kind of golden chicken right to the left of the person's head. And so I'm wondering which of these tools are ones that you actively use? The saw photo on the right is maybe a clue. And then also which of these tools, if any, are used in more industrialized settings for the processing and cutting of meat, or are they things that are really specific to a butcher shop setting? Because that's one of the things I was interested in this painting, is sort of where it fits, its moment in the history of the kind of move to the industrialization of meat processing and cutting, which is well established by 1975.
Yeah.
Does she take us back to a different way of treating meat than the kind of full-scale industrial version?
Yeah, I mean, definitely, as you see, that we still use a saw that's very similar to the one that's represented in the painting there. That's in a shop like ours, we use primarily a 5 or 6 inch, we call a boning knife, which we are able to separate the individual muscles from the bone and from each other. We have what we use, we call it an 8-inch breaking knife, which is similar to what's underneath the big cut of meat there.
Oh, can we go to the next slide, Louise, please? Yeah.
So like that one there, which has a similar curve to that. The curve is good for portioning and for trimming, separating the fat from the lean. This one looks more like a chef's knife than what we would use. Just from looking at the angle of the like the blade, like the beveling of the blade. Looks like it would be more for chopping than for slicing. It's very similar to what we would use nowadays. And also the sharpening steel that's hanging there, that's used every 5 minutes or so in our shop to keep our knives sharp. It's not necessarily for sharpening, it's just for honing the edges. So you would use a sharpening stone to actually create the edge on your knife. And then you would use that steel there hanging to hone the edge and take off any burrs that are on the edge of it, just to maintain the blade's edge for a longer period of time. We sharpen our knives at least once a week, just to make sure that they stay sharp and safe, because a dull knife not only doesn't get the job done, but it's also very dangerous. You really have to force it, and that could end up being bad for your fingers. As for the scissors, and we don't typically use scissors at our shop other than to cut paper. We need to. They do they look like more of like like shears that we'd have at like at a florist or even like cutting like construction paper or something. But they could also be similar to poultry shears in a way, and and they are next to the hanging poultry there. So maybe there's a relationship there. But it's not something that we use here. We do really prefer to use the knives, especially the 5 or 6 inch knives for everything that we do, just because they have, we're just so much more precise using that. It's a skill that we teach all of our butchers when they come in, to be able to use the small knife to cut down something very large, and it's a skill that only a handful of people are able to possess, which is great. But everything else in there, I mean, the saw we do use. If we're not using the, because we can't use the knives to cut through bone, so we do use a hand saw to cut through the, the marrow bones sometimes, and also we call the chine bone, which would be the part that's underneath the eye of the rib section there. And then of course there's the hooks, and we see there are hooks everywhere in butcher shops. The hooks that are represented in the painting we use for hanging our coats, but there are hooks that we do use at our shop that have an S shape that would be used for hanging meat or for hanging sausages as well.
Actually, Louise, if we can look at the next one. This is just a later painting that Sharrer made that also takes us into more explicitly, I think, into a shop. And there we see kind of some of these same motifs with the kind of butcher actively with the knife and the sharpening steel, but then also there's the kind of reference to sausages that I was thinking about, but then also these kind of mobile hooks, it looks like, things that kind of slide around. Looks maybe even more like a site of processing. Are any of these tools that, as far as you know, are used in kind of larger industrialized? Or
yeah, and they're used. So he's standing in front of a walk-in refrigerator with looks like that's a lamb hanging in there. And if you come to our shop, you see the exact same thing. Lamb hanging in our walk-in on an S hook right there. in terms of, you have the rail system set up on the ceiling there. That is more of an industrial type of apparatus. I mean, something that we could use here as well, because we do get the whole animal. It'll probably make things easier, but we don't do this much volume at once, so it's not as necessary for us. There is a place called Cereos that just recently closed in Northampton. That they were a butcher shop for years, and they still had a functioning rail system on their ceiling of their shop when they were taking in whole animals back, generations ago. But you would still see that type of system in both an industrial setting and also a larger butcher shop than ours, and with the same type of hooks there, same trolleys. In fact, there's a hook right above the butcher's head. Looks kind of like an anchor, and that is a hook used as the logo and the namesake of a butcher shop and friends of ours in Brooklyn called the Meat Hook, and they're in Williamsburg, and that would be their logo there. That hook there. But we wouldn't, if we were actually cutting at that volume and had meat like that in our walk-in refrigerator, we wouldn't hang it next to a processed item. I don't think that our health inspector would have liked that either, because you don't want to have processed meat next to something raw. And also they would be under different environments too, in terms of the temperature and the humidity level. To have, raw meat needs to hang at a drier, or actually a wetter temperature than the salami there. That would need to be a little bit drier to leach out the excess water there to keep it safe to eat and a cured item.
Yeah, I kind of think in some ways with this painting that the Greek sculpture to the right in the foreground, sort of for those of us who don't know those details about what the kind of best practices are in terms of storage, it kind of clues us in that we're not in quite the butcher shop that in the loose hook that's kind of floating around, and that things are a little bit a kilter or off kilter. Louise, can we do the next slide, please? So Sharrer was someone who really throughout her lifetime addressed class, power, and gender. And I just wanted to show kind of her two best known paintings for folks, the Tribute to the American Working People on the left and Reception on the right. And Terry, you already mentioned this, but I thought we might kind of think about it a little bit more. Just these social and class dimensions that are very much explicit in this selection of her prime subject of this meat, cut of meat. So is there anything else you kind of want to add to that? And we could go to the next slide, please, Louise, about sort of how, like, the kind of class and social dimensions of the prime rib, or of any of the other kind of foods that we see in it.
Yeah, people recognize that cut of meat because it's meat. I mean, there's the rib there. It's something that it is, there's a name in American beef culture called prime, and that's about the fat levels and marbling that's within a cut. But there's also something called like a prime cut, which would be just the finer cut of meat, and this would be a prime cut in that regard, the second regard, where it would be the one that that's what you would lust after if you were a carnivore. Fortunately, it's also one of the most expensive cuts. And the one that would be actually the most expensive would be the tenderloin or the filet mignon, but that's just a long cylindrical cut of meat, and that doesn't really have much appeal to the eye necessarily. Whereas this, you see it and like that's meat, and that's what the best steakhouses would sell. That's what the best restaurants would have on their menu as like their cut of meat would be something from here, from the prime rib section. Whether or not it's the best tasting one or one you can get the most tender, or what I find to be my favorite cut, that may not be the case, but it's what, it's one of the big three cuts I think that at least Americans see as like the major cuts of meat that are available and for offer at a butcher's counter. Would be this one, the T-bone and the fillet. And yeah, there's definitely, you see something of that size and like, only a handful of people are going to be able to buy something like that at any given time. But if they are, I hope they're sharing, you know.
Yeah, that's always in my notes. Like, this is not something that you would, for one or two people. I mean, it sort of conjures this larger social impact, like you said, that like, a sort of holiday or a birthday or a special event in which many people are assembling together. So probably also not something that people have been buying much in the past 14, 15 months as well, given.
And as a butcher too, we're really, and we'll sell out of that cut every week because, off of a whole head of beef, we only have 16 steaks of 16 ribeyes. And so, we're happy to sell it. But what we really want to sell is, these other cuts, like, something off of the sirloin, or something like an unknown cut, or unknown to some people, off of the shoulder section, like the terrace major cut, or what we call the flat iron cut. All those things that make up the whole animal, we're trying to get through, and just as good, I think, if not more flavorful than a prime rib, but at half the price. And that's what a butcher, that's what our job is, to offer these things that can be more affordable and just as good as something with this high price tag.
If we go to the next slide, please. So I mentioned that we have some preparatory works for the painting, and what I love about these is they really show us some of the ideas that Sharrer was working through on her way to the final composition. And in all three of them, we see a pig, sort of pink upside down pig in the left, but it's always, feet up in the three studies. And the chicken is also more prominent in the painted sketch. So, but to me, these three sketches offer up a different set of relationships around meat than the final painting, because in each of them we have this relationship that gets set up between pork, beef, and poultry, and that kind of changes course, I think, a little bit by the final painting, where the beef is really is the centerpiece of the table and of the painting and of where our eye goes. And so in my research and preparing for today, one of the things I learned was sort of the movement of American meat consumption since the 19th century, where beef replaced pork in prominence, and then chicken in the latter part of the 20th century replaced beef as the most consumed, in part, obviously due to changes in industrialization, and how mechanics around refrigeration and that kind of stuff, but also because of ideas around the healthfulness or not of different things, with meats, with chicken being seen as a kind of healthier food. So I'm wondering if you could just tell us a little bit about how these different valences of beef, pork, and chicken, kind of how you see them, and sort of how they influence maybe assumptions that people have or bring to the meat that they consume, and how that sort of shows up for you in your work.
Yeah, I mean, we sell a lot of beef and chicken. We sell a good amount of pork as well. And during the pandemic, we were, or just up until actually last week, we were closed to walk-in customers. We were only doing phone orders with the backdoor pickup. And so we sold a lot of beef, because people go to a butcher shop, they think, I'm going to go there and, call them and get a steak. But now that we've been open for 2 weeks, we've been selling a lot more pork, because they remember that, oh yeah, we can source this, get this locally sourced pork here as well. For a place like ours, where it's kind of like, sometimes people see it as like a special occasion type place, they do come and get these nice cuts of meat, like a steak, like a ribeye steak. But there are so many different things they offer as well, like the pork chops, sausages, cutlets, and things like that. We found that chicken is also quite popular. We definitely sell for volume, like we sell more chickens than anything else. Just from our rotisserie to whole chickens to breasts, that they fly out the door here, not literally, but they're it's all, those are like the big three here: beef, pork, and chicken. They're get a lot out of beef. but people, it's interesting though, because chicken is the only one really that people buy as a whole animal, you know, and then take home. You know, people don't typically buy a whole pig and go roast that themselves, or, you know, a whole head of beef, you know, obviously just for the size of it. But, you know, when they think of eating beef or pork, they don't think of eating an animal. They think of eating a steak or a burger, you know, so there's like this dissociation between, you know, that animal that was alive at one point and now is their dinner. Whereas like a chicken though, you know, it's basically looking right at you, you know, in the oven. And people seem to be really fine with that as like, you know, something for poultry, but not so much with the other quadrupeds, like, you know, like pigs and beef. You know, there's also in our shop, there's been a lot more people wanting to buy lamb and goat. You know, we don't sell as much of those as other things, but they're gaining popularity. And, you know, I think it's, you know, outside of America, I believe that the lamb and goat and goat especially is the most popularly consumed protein worldwide. But it's something that isn't gaining, or is slowly but surely gaining some traction here in America.
It's interesting what you said about the kind of, because it's definitely true for me, of the kind of relationship to the whole animal being different with chicken versus beef, because I hadn't sort of thought about that in relationship to this painting, but we do get the headless but whole kind of poultry in the background, and then this very kind of clearly partial cow, or, you know, in the as the main event. And so it seems like the painting is also maybe setting up something of that just different relationship that we have to these different animals and their food that they provide. If we go to the next slide, please, back to our painting. So before we turn over for the Q&A, I have one last question. Maybe it's a few questions in one, but I've been really interested to learn more about the history of large-scale meat processing and sales in the U.S. As it relates to how these processes were industrialized at the beginning, sort of starting in the middle of the 19th century in the U.S., but also how that then connects to developments and how food is sold, specifically through the development of supermarkets, chain supermarkets, self-service counters that then are what sort of replaces the butcher shop, the movement of slaughterhouses out of cities into rural areas, all of this kind of stuff. And I think, you know, it's accurate or factual to say that this industrialization has done great harm to animals and to the people who process them and to the environment. But I see your work and what you do at Sutter Meats as really being committed to another approach that centers community care and stewardship, but also requires to work on a really different scale than this larger scale. And so I wondered if you could just share your perspective on how these changes in the raising and processing of animals for meat, what your perspective is on that, and who does that work, and how that kind of plays out today. And maybe also that's the question of sort of how you got into this. And then going back to this question around class, I've been wondering too, and this sort of open with this, just the cost, that the first thing you see is the cost of this meat. How do you guys address these expectations about what meat should cost? Because part of what the industrialization of meat has done is to deflate any understanding of what the true cost, right, of it is. But then that also brings up questions about who even has the choice to purchase meat that came from well cared for animals and that was processed by people who are well cared for, and who doesn't. And just these are like all things that I've been thinking about sort of in our exchanges, and just wanted to kind of hear you talk about.
Sure. Yeah, I mean, so one of the primary reasons we chose to open our shop in Northampton is just the close proximity to so many farms that are doing great work with the land and with the animals they're raising. You know, we when I opened places in New York for other people, and we would call local anything within 200 miles. And you see that, you know, I think that's just around the country, that's what they say, you know, local 150, 200 miles. But here at Sutter Meats, everything comes within 20 miles. And these are from farms that we know, we visited, that we've had, you know, we've shared meals with the farmers. We consider them friends. And we know that they're doing what's best for, you know, their animals that they're raising, for the land that, you know, that the animals are on, and for the families that they're feeding as well. You we have a very close or very small supply chain, a very short supply chain rather. It's just farmers, slaughterhouse, which is Adams Farm and Athol, and us. So, we never have any issues when there's like, you see on the news that, people aren't able to get their beef or their chicken, because these large industrial, processing companies are having issues because, there's no real middleman, with us. Adams that we work with, it's a family-run operation as well. They do all of the slaughtering. It's certified humane, designed by a woman named Temple Grandin, who's well-known in sustainability and animal welfare circles. So we did research here to find a place that we could work with partners that would have the same vision as we had in terms of the quality and the transparency of the meat that we're getting. And that it was just a small system that wasn't easily affected by outside influences like, what you see in the Midwest right now. Our prices also in that way, they're higher, but they also don't fluctuate the same as a lot of the commodity prices you see. Just because, we set a fair price with our farmers, one that will provide for them, keep them able to raise animals and to be able to maintain the sustainability that we want to provide and achieve here. In terms of the cost of the meat to the consumer, yeah, it's a little bit higher, but it's not necessarily that expensive. We sell a rotisserie chicken here, which is one of the only cooked items we have that they average about $24 to $25, but they feed 5 or 6 people. And so if you break that down, it's not much more than buying, Happy Meals for everybody in the family, and you get something a lot more, with more nutrition and, and from a smaller farm, and also, that's better for your body and the environment. We do also offer now, and something that we've been working on for years, and finally we're able now to do is we're able to take EBT and SNAP benefits here at Sutter Meats. So it's not just people who have expendable income to come in and spend $100 on a couple of steaks. Now it's pretty much everybody is able to come here and provide for themselves and for their family. So we really are trying to narrow that gap between the eater and their food source. And it's small. It's a small community we have here, but I think we're able to provide for them pretty well here. And we've been doing the best we can. We have some fantastic customers. A lot of regulars have been with us for 7 years now. And the farmers, we've had the same handful of farmers since we started as well. And we're happy to see what's happened to our store, and hopefully we can keep going for another 7 to 10 years too.
Great. Thank you. So I think we can turn to some of the questions. So folks in the audience, if you want to drop any questions you have in the Q&A. I think we have a question about the image of Christ and the child in the painting and the symbolism behind that. I will recommend, so it's from the Passion, and I feel like there's a lot that kind of one could go into that, but there's a great essay by Robert Cozzolino in the Sharrer catalog, which I will make a plug for, that talks about her relationship to religious imagery and the ways that she was deeply schooled in it and kind of took it in different directions. But it was something that Terry and I were also looking at when we were looking at the painting and thinking about the relationship to the blood on the knife as well, and all of these very sharp implements that sort of punctuate and the kind of hooks in the back that also feel like a little crown of thorns. So I don't know, Terry, if you want to add anything about that.
Yeah, just like, one thing that we had talked about before was the idea of sacrifice too. And, we were saying earlier, it's like how, people, when they're buying meat, they're not buying, they don't think of it as buying a part of an animal. They think of it as a dish already, like a burger or a steak or a sausage. But there is something that had to been sacrificed there in order to make that meal possible. And so you see that, the knife of the blood. At this point too, I've mentioned that all of the blood is gone from the animal. you say like a bloody steak when you cook it rare, but it's not necessarily blood. It would be more water and protein or pigment. But this does look like, just when if you look closely to that, it does look like it has the viscosity of blood, which then to me also, yeah, I look at that knife and then look up at the picture of Christ, and there's some relationship there with him being a sacrificial lamb as well.
Yeah, and that was actually one of the things that changed, I think, for you looking at this painting on a screen, and then when we had you in the museum to see it in person. And I think initially you thought it was just more the kind of liquids, and then in person, being able to see it up close sort of confirmed for you that it was blood, which also is maybe a detail that introduces this difference that Sharrer was kind of known for, that we might assume it's this one thing, but actually it sort of is something that couldn't have come from that if the blood has already been drained out. So we have a question about the scale of the beef seeming pretty off. Is it much larger than normal? And also what the relationship is between the figure and the meat. So I don't know if you want to talk about the scale, because that was something that we talked about in person.
Yeah, that's big. I mean, it's I mean, that knife actually couldn't really do it justice. I mean, I don't know what the knife there is meant to do other than just reflect the underside of the meat itself, because that knife would be the equivalent of like one of our 5-inch boning knives or something of that size, which would be out of place with a cut of meat that large. But yeah, I guess you're going to call the painting meat. You should really have a large representation of it somewhere up front and center.
It's definitely larger than life, I think we decided in person. Yeah. And with the figure too, I mean, this is something that I find kind of curious about the painting, is the way that you have this figure who is this kind of raised as a child, but maybe not entirely, who's cornered, really literally cornered off in the upper right corner. So the sharpening tool makes this kind of vertical divide, and then the table, which it's unclear if it's a vertical or horizontal surface, also kind of makes this divide to sort of completely separate off this figure who seems to be staring past it. I mean, that was something we also were talking about in front of the painting, that this figure doesn't seem to make eye contact with either the viewer or with the meat. It just seems to be this kind of two planes passing each other, and not interacting either with any of his surroundings.
Yeah. But like, are you going to cook this or am I? I don't know.
I think it's already on the table, so it seems like it's ready to go. And I think the scale too, to the question of scale, like the lemons and the cigarettes and the match, which might be hard to see depending on folks' screens, but there's a match in the top of the table to the left. These all feel like they're to actual scale, and so they add this kind of increase the feeling, for me at least, of the disproportionate size of the centerpiece of the table. We have a question about a lesser known cut of meat that you would recommend.
Well, if you like ribeye steaks, then you would really like, we call a Denver steak, and that is off of the chuck plate or boneless short rib that runs just right next to that rib section, and has a similar marbling, similar texture. It's a boneless cut, but you cook it the same way and has the same type of mouthfeel that people would like from a good steak. So I highly recommend that. It's called Denver steak, like the city.
So now we have a question about how you moved from photography to meat.
Yeah, I don't know. I had, living in New York City, I had a lot of friends who worked in the restaurant industry, a lot of chefs and restaurant owners, and people work front of house as well. And it was a world that I like. I like the idea of being able to provide for people and share these meals, and I love to cook, but I really didn't like the hours that they had to work, and also I was more involved and more interested in the sourcing of food products. So I had a friend who was butchering, and he told me about Josh, who had opened Fleischer's in Kingston, outside of in the Hudson Valley. So I took a bus up to meet him, and he asked me to be an apprentice for him. So I moved into their house. Actually, I moved into an Airstream trailer on their front yard, and he taught me how to butcher and helped me find work back in New York City. And yeah, went from there.
So we have a question. It says it looks like really hard physical labor to be a butcher. Do you expect to be able to do this work when you're in your 60s and older?
No, I don't. I mean, I guess I could. I try to keep fit so I can do it. It's a lot. It's very taxing on the elbows and shoulders and wrists. We you know, yeah, we have to take a lot of self-care when we're not working. But you know, part of my job is also to train, you know, the next generation too. So I'll have people to do a lot of the heavy lifting and a lot of the major cutting that you know, when I can't do it. So, but yeah, being able to work with the farms and being able to you know, to help people find better quality products, that's really the passion that I have. So I can continue doing that until, you know, forever. So, you know, that's the primary job of a butcher. Really, it's like the difference between, they call a butcher and a meat cutter. And a meat cutter would be the person in the you know, on the floor at the industrial place, you know, doing the same repetitive tasks over and over. A butcher is more about the sourcing and you know, bringing together, you know, the farms with you know, the person who needs that quality product. So that's what I'm here for.
And we have one last question, and then I think we'll wrap up. So it says the Italians use lemon on their meat. Do you think lemons are associated with the meat because of the practical association, or do they have a more symbolic meaning? And I didn't know that. So do you have any thoughts on that?
That's interesting. Yeah. And I thought that she actually used a lot of lemons. Like that was a motif that she had like in another, like a lot of her works, but I could see, yeah, I mean, that could be association there, even though wasn't she more influenced by French butchery than Italian?
Yeah, and certainly Dutch painting as well. I mean, I guess, so I think that would be an interesting question to kind of learn more about. I sort of thought of the lemons as either part of this trompe l'oeil effect of this two-scale depiction of different foods and these different angles too, which is kind of also harkens back to still life painting, a history of still life painting, but then also maybe with the seafood. So, but they are very much kind of creating a shape around the meat, sort of the way that they're clearly in conversation with it by their proximity, the way that the knife is. So yeah, that's a good question. Yeah. I'm curious about how what sort of food recipes there are.
And I love, I don't eat a lot of lemon with my beef, but with pork, yeah, it's one of the best things ever. We actually, when my wife and I, when we went on our honeymoon, we were in an island called Ischia off the coast of Naples, visiting some friends who had a house there. And there was, in Ischia, there was a small village with the butcher shop that had been there for generations. And the butcher, we went in there because my friend told him that I was a butcher. And so he was cutting all these special cuts of meat for us. And it was all pork though. And he cut this cut called capicola, which I had only known at that point as a cured item. But it's like, no. It's like the best cut comes from right off of the neck of the pig. You know, take it home and you cook it for 14 minutes, like you have to do it over an open flame, wood, flipping it every minute for 14 minutes. And then you finish it with a squeeze of lemon. But they're like these special lemons that they have out there on Ischia and also along the Amalfi Coast that have like a mix of, you know, they have that like a kind of sweet savory thing going on. But I'm telling you, that was like one of the best things I've ever eaten. And I've been trying to do that now at home with our store-bought lemons, just like chasing the lemon dragon. And it hasn't been quite as good, but you know, going back to that was one of the best things I've ever eaten. So I can attest to like lemon being a great compliment to meat, whether or not I've tried it on beef. You know, maybe I'll go home and do that tonight. But yeah, lemon is a fantastic condiment to use.
Maybe we'll end there. Thank you so much, Terry, and thank you all for joining us today. I'll hand it back to Lauren, who will take it from here.
Hi, everyone. Thank you all again for joining today, and thank you, Emma and Terry, for your wonderful presentation, and Louise Krieger for her assistance behind the scenes. We have a few programs scheduled for this summer, including another SCMA Conversations on Thursday, July 15th, as well as Open Eyes on Thursday, July 22nd. Please visit our website for more information. Finally, I wanted to thank our fabulous members and donors who make programs like this possible. If you are not a member, or if you have questions about membership, please go to our website for more information. Thank you all so much again. Have a great day.